You're good.
So as all of you may already know, I'm a sophomore in the Foley High School Science Research Program. My name is Rosario, and I will be educating you guys on Parkinson's disease. So what exactly is Parkinson's disease? And so to start off, Parkinson's disease is a progressive neurodegenerative disorder that affects the brain. And so it's being a neurodegenerative disorder, it definitely mentally affects the brain. And the progressive word there is also important because it's not just a static disease, right? It worsens over time. The conditions of the disease worsen over time. And so it's basically caused by the death of specific neurons in the brain that are basically dopaminergic neurons, that they have to do with dopamine. And the cause of Parkinson's today basically remains unknown. It's an open question. And we know that it's caused by this lack of these dopaminergic neurons in the brain, but we don't know exactly what leads to them yet. And that is, of course, the subject of intense and dedicated research. And so, despite there not being, we don't quite know or understand the cause of the disease, and there is no cure, there are several treatment options for the disease to alleviate the symptoms. And so, I'll then explain, right, and elaborate on the symptoms of the disease. So there are primary motor symptoms, including a resting tremor, which simply means that, usually like the people who are afflicted with the disease, they tend to, in their hands or feet, simply tremble a little bit involuntarily, and that is one of the kind of cardinal signals of possessing the disease. And there's also bradykinesia, which is simply basically this difficulty in moving that is associated with disease. And there's rigidity as well because the muscles do not really relax in the patient, right? So their muscles, their muscle tone is generally very stiff. And there's also postural instability. It is very difficult for them to maintain, the standing posture, right? And so some examples of secondary motor symptoms are freezing and micrographia. And so these kind of show the effects of the primary motor symptoms. So freezing is simply this tendency when patients afflicted with Parkinson's disease, when they walk, they have a tendency to kind of stop and hesitate. And this is because of the difficulty involved in moving. And micrographia is simply that patients with Parkinson's disease tend to have very small handwriting. And this is because bradykinesia makes it very difficult for them to perform repetitive tasks. And so it leads to this smaller handwriting. And other symptoms include loss of smell, mood disorders, and sleep disturbances. These are, extraneous symptoms that are also caused by this disease. And these symptoms are not just static, right? So they don't just stay the same because Parkinson's disease is progressive. These symptoms tend to worsen over time, right? And so, how exactly is a patient who may or may not have Parkinson's disease diagnosed? Now, diagnosis of Parkinson's disease are usually made by a general physician, and they carefully examine your medical history, and they basically look for the primary symptoms that are associated with the disease, such as bradykinesia and rest tremor. And they also usually study the response when a patient is given levodopa, which is a treatment. So that they look at how you respond to that drug, and if you respond, like the symptoms get better, that means you may have Parkinson's because you responded to that drug. And so onto the treatment for Parkinson's, right? It has a variety of treatments. So there are the primary medication is levodopa, and exactly what this is, it's a precursor to dopamine in the brain. So having levodopa basically allows your brain to kind of have more dopamine, that is inherently lacking when you have Parkinson's. And that is the primarily, the main drug. But as the disease progresses over time, the patients may not respond in the same way. So there are other drugs that, when their response to levodopa progressively lessens, they can pursue other drugs such as dopamine agonists, which basically, in lieu of dopamine, they activate the dopamine receptors in the brain, and MAOB inhibitors. And so what those do is that those inhibit the enzymes that inhibit dopamine, right? So they prevent dopamine itself from being inhibited. And so those are generally the main kind of drugs that are used to treat Parkinson's. And patients can also have their symptoms treated through a surgical procedure known as deep brain stimulation, or DBS. And it's a relatively new procedure that has been kind of proliferating over the past few years. And this is generally used for patients who have advanced symptoms. And it basically entails having an electrical device implemented into the brain, and the electrical signals that it sends basically alleviate these symptoms to some degree. So on to the kind of just basic neurology of the disease. So right here we have the basal ganglia region of the brain, right? And so this is the region that is affected by Parkinson's. And specifically, the substantia nigra part, which is this in the bottom left-hand corner. And so basically, this region is one specifically affected by Parkinson's. And so if we go on to the next slide, you see that this highlighted region right here is the one that is affected by the disease, right? These neurons that are dopaminergic. And so in Parkinson's disease, those fade over time. So you see that this would be a patient who has Parkinson's, where these neurons have basically ceased to exist, right? And this pathway in the brain is basically controls movement. And so this makes sense when this region of the brain is detrimentally affected, that this would affect movement, right? It's more difficult to move when the pathway that controls and regulates movement is, significantly degraded. So onto current research in Parkinson's, that it kind of has two focuses, right? So they're looking for better ways to treat the disease, right? So they're kind of looking to improve upon the drugs that already exist, and as well, they're trying to understand Parkinson's just in general and possibly find a cure, right? So now onto studying more specific studies that involve these bullet points here, right? An investigation conducted at Umia University kind of looked for any new ways in which they could conduct deep brain stimulation. So what they did is that they put the electrical stimulation that occurs in deep brain stimulation in the caudal zona incerta region of the brain, right? And they kind of tested to see whether this new region of the brain might have increased efficacy compared to the regular conventional region of the brain where it is implemented, which are either the global pallidus interna region or the subthalamic nucleus regions, right? Those were usually used. And the study did find that symptoms were alleviated, but not as much as the conventional region. So they basically put these electrical signals in a different part of the brain that might have been associated with relieving the symptoms, and it did work, but not as much as conventional methods. So these researchers are looking to see if they can improve it, and in this case, that was not the case. But again, they are researching to see if they can improve this. Now, another study, right, that is completely unrelated, instead established a correlation between the ablation of striatal cholinergic neurons and the attenuation of levodopa-induced dyskinesia. So, what all those excessively complex words are trying to communicate is that basically they ablated or kind of limited the amount of cholinergic neurons in the striatum area of the brain, which is closely associated with the substantia nigra part, which is where the dopamine loss occurs in the brain in Parkinson's. And so they found that doing that, and they tested this on mice, that this attenuated or improved the condition of levodopa-induced dyskinesia. And it's important to note that they were basically trying to see if they can alleviate the side effects of levodopa by basically destroying part of these cholinergic neurons. And so drugs associated with Parkinson's are unfortunately not perfect. They do have their side effects, and levodopa, which is the primary drug used to treat Parkinson's, has what is called LID, or levodopa-induced dyskinesia, where basically it becomes excessively difficult to conduct voluntary actions, right? And so they were trying to see if they could conduct this study and by ablating cholinergic neurons to see if they could reduce the side effect of that drug, right? And so onto more research, a study analyzing therapeutics that targeted the mitochondria, what they found is that this could possibly limit the degeneration of the dopaminergic neurons that, when they die, that causes Parkinson's disease. So they found that drugs that focus on the mitochondria could possibly reduce this progressive degeneration of the disease, that it could stop these dopaminergic neurons from dying in the brain. And this is very important because that means that they could limit the amount of degeneration that occurs in these neurons. And so basically, this is important to note because Parkinson's disease research has been heavily associated with the mitochondria, right? There's a strong link with several mitochondrially associated enzymes that have been linked to Parkinson's, and it is not completely understood yet, but there is some sort of correlation that they have established working with this. And so another study was looking at genetic Parkinson's, because Parkinson's generally occurs, relatively randomly, but there is, in rare instances, Parkinson's that is actually caused by genetic factors. And the genes associated with these are, to researchers, completely random. In other words, these mutations really have no link. And so what this study tried to do is it tried to understand why, in these genetic cases of Parkinson's, why these kind of random mutations that have to do with completely unrelated proteins, how in each of those cases they lead to Parkinson's disease. And so what they suggested is that possibly, despite these proteins being relatively unrelated, their link was in that they have to do with the mitochondria in some way, right? And so that's what they suggest, that the disease is heavily associated with.
Let me call you back in 2 minutes. I just have a student
and
presenting.
They established this thing through studying genetic Parkinson's. And so, having said that, that is that.
What do babies have to do with Parkinson's?
A whole lot they have to do.
Few questions. I'm kidding. Yeah, Gavin, you had a question.
So the whole you basically demonstrated that Parkinson's occurs as a result of the death of dopamine producing neurons, right? So what is it about the death of these neurons that results in the symptoms associated with Parkinson's, such as like stiffness or freezing? What is it about like the loss of this dopamine that causes you to have?
I guess I didn't really elaborate on this too much, but basically, in the slide, I showed that this is the kind of region that dies, and that this is called the direct pathway, right, in the brain. And so basically, the brain has a set amount of kind of these predetermined motions that you can do. So the brain already has wired kind of these blueprints. If say you want to, right, flex your elbow, right, your brain has that set out. And so basically, there's a direct and indirect pathway, and the direct pathway allows that blueprint to go out and you execute that action. And then the indirect pathway just kind of blocks the rest of all the other blueprints and only allows that one to execute the action you want, right? But so with the degradation of the direct pathway, it makes it harder for the brain to execute that action that it wants. And so that leads to, it being much more difficult for you to do movement. Right.
Oh yeah, and you mentioned deep brain stimulation, which I found very interesting. Are there possibly negative effects for deep brain stimulation? Because you mentioned that it was used typically for like people who are suffering from severe Parkinson's. Because like I would expect such like a affecting the brain such like a massive way could possibly have a negative effect. If, like,
so I'm not very well acquainted with, right, the kind of like specific side effects of these treatments, but from what I understand, deep brain stimulation is pretty effective, and I really don't understand like the specific side effects that have to do with like any negative side effects with it.
Okay.
You mentioned that the death of the direct pathways is like specific to the basal ganglia. So do dopaminergic neurons die only in the basal ganglia, or are there also deaths in other parts of the brain?
This is basically where it occurs in this region.
So just the basal ganglia? That's like Parkinson's only?
I think that's the only place like where the dopaminergic neurons like exist, but I'm not entirely certain of that. However, from what I understand, this is the region where it occurs.
Wait, I know the drugs said they like. Can you re-explain what the drugs do? Like the agonists.
So yeah, basically they treat the disease, and so levodopa is a precursor to dopamine in the brain, so able to cross the blood-brain barrier, and that kind of alleviates the lack of dopamine in the brain caused by Parkinson's, because it's a precursor, so it allows the brain to basically have more dopamine. And so then dopamine agonists, what they do is that in lieu of dopamine, they directly activate the dopaminergic receptors, right? So they activate, the what is supposed to go with dopamine instead of dopamine. And then MAOB inhibitors, what they do is that they inhibit the enzymes that inhibit dopamine, right? And so those generally in different ways, and kind of they take different approaches, but what they do is that they allow the brain to kind of more freely have dopamine when it's lacking in Parkinson's.
You mentioned something about like the genetic correlation, right? So like I'm not so familiar about it, but are there like a lot of situations with Parkinson's that are genetically coded?
So I was kind of looking into this, and basically there is genetic Parkinson's where they have established a link between a certain mutation and the person having Parkinson's, but this is really rare, and the vast majority of instances of Parkinson's are not genetically related. But let's just try to use a model, and was using these genetic cases of Parkinson's to see how that might connect with the non-genetic versions.
You said that some treatments include targeting mitochondria because this limits the degeneration of dopaminergic cells. So, what mechanisms in like the mitochondria targeting allow the prevention of degeneration?
Well, this was really kind of like a pioneer study because this is what researchers are trying to investigate. What link does mitochondria have with the degeneration of dopaminergic neurons? They're trying to understand that. It's just not very well understood at this time.
So when you're talking about genetic, so is it like certain gene mutations? So you mentioned that they're random. So I don't know, like, do they have like specific gene mutations in it?
So basically, what the study tried to do is that from a glance, it appeared that these mutations, in the ways that they affect the different proteins that they code for, that these proteins really didn't have anything to do with each other. But the study kind of suggested it was like, these seem kind of disparate and random, but they might, they all have this kind of link in that they all tie in some way to the mitochondria. And again, this is not very well understood, but this is what they're trying to research, and so that there is this strong link between the mitochondria and the degeneration of dopaminergic neurons.
Can you go back to the direct pathway slide? So we're looking at direct, so the substantia nigra is the region of the brain that's most associated with Parkinson's disease. So that was my question. So that is the substantia nigra, the origination of the direct pathway?
Oh, it's not the origination. It's going like from this way to this way. So it's going from here.
Oh, okay. So
to
it's
here.
going.
So it's kind of like the destination.
The destination of the direct pathway. And that's my next question. When you say direct pathway, is that talking about that pathway alone? Or are there a number of direct pathways associated with
From what I understand, it's just this general region where there's just a lot of connections there,
Okay.
and that's kind of where the motor blueprints pass through. That when those neurons, when the signals pass through those, it travels through the substantia nigra and then to like other parts of the brain to like then tell the body to execute an action.
So any type of motor movement passes through, for the most part, we're generalizing, maybe not every, but for the most part, we're saying that every type of motor movement is passing through that direct path.
Yeah, and the brain is complex, like, because it's coming from like, it's like the cerebral cortex through like here, the striatum, and then it goes to all these different places, but
But
through all these places,
the substantia nigra.
that is the place where the link is kind of diminishing.
And then from the substantia nigra, that signal is sent out to carry out that movement.
Yeah, I think it goes to the thalamus first.
Okay, substantia
This
nigra.
region.
Any other questions? I have one more. So since I was just going to ask you this on the side. Since there's really we have the rare instances of genetic Parkinson's, that you're saying it's very rare. It'd be interesting what the percentages are. But for the most part, we kind of look at Parkinson's as being a random disease. So therefore, it's a random disease. We can't really associate with any gene. My question is, have you read anything or seen anything linking it to any type of epigenetic mechanism?
I'm not sure, but like from what I read on the study, the genetic Parkinson's, it is rare, and that Parkinson's, generally doesn't have anything to do with like epigenetics or anything like that.
Right.
But I'm not sure if there's any studies that have tried to make a correlation between them. from what I understand, there is no like connection there.
Are there any other Parkinson's within a family of disorders? Like, is it closely associated with any other disorders? I'm asking this to you and you at the same time, I think.
Yeah, so
Is there any- yeah, so-
generally it's movement disorder, and it's kind of connected with other movement disorders. I think such as Huntington's is one that I know, and
Have there been any
from
connections between
the
Huntington-
place that I got this, I saw that where it's highlighted here causes Parkinson's, but that here, this line right here, that death causes Huntington's. And like that's out of my scope, so I didn't look into that. But that's something that I noticed. So they're kind of closely associated.
The reason why I'm asking that is if in the family, so Huntington's disease, I'm sure there's going to be some other disorders associated as well. Have there been mitochondrial links in those studies of those disorders to fortify the belief that there might be mitochondrial links?
Been out of like the scope of like what I've looked into. So from what I understand, there haven't been, or I haven't.
That's what I thought. But it might be something interesting to look into. Everybody good? Good job. Who's up next?